Well, good morning.
Good morning,
Good morning.
Chuck.
Happy Father's Day.
Thank you. Happy Father's Day to anybody watching here. Whenever you do see this, it won't be Father's Day anymore, but still, happy Father's Day if it applies to you. So, today is a very interesting lesson where we're going to actually start with this very long list of examples in Hebrews chapter 11, where we will be using the examples of these great men and women of the faith to examine what faith means. And as we talked about last week, faith is more than just a definition of a word, more than just a feeling or an attitude, though it is all of those things. Where we see it in the book of Hebrews chapter 11 is exemplified in the deeds and actions of these men and women that the author of Hebrews talks about. But what he's pointing out is it isn't the deeds and the actions that are the faith. The deeds and the actions are energized by faith. So what we're seeing here exemplified is that faith results in change in our life. Faith results in deeds and actions in our life that are a reflection of that faith. So we all talk about, as being evangelicals, as being grace-oriented theologian as I am, I'm always sort of hesitant to talk about works and deeds because I don't want to leave the impression that that's how we earn God's favor, because certainly it isn't. But at the same time, the faith, the genuine faith that is in our hearts, that's in our spirits, what should be the natural outgrowth of that are these deeds and actions. Not because we're doing them to earn God's favor, but because they come out of our faith. And our faith is what energizes and enables us to do these things, so that they are the natural outflows of a life of faith. In other words, it's not something that somebody guilts you into doing or tells you you have to do or you feel some obligation to do it. It just happens naturally when faith is in your heart. And so the pattern, as we will see going through this, is this phrase, by faith. This is how each one of the sections is introduced, and of course it's how it introduced the chapter as well. And so this is the great repeating pattern of the chapter, and therefore it's the repeating pattern of these men and women's lives, where we see from the history what they did and what they accomplished and what God did through their lives. But what he's pointing out here is that it was their faith which enabled and energized these acts of faith, these actions and deeds in their lives. It's faith that energizes them. And the reason that's relevant to his overall point of the superiority of Christ is that it is not their adherence to the law that made them great, if you want to use that term. It was their faith. Even though most of these people lived under law, nonetheless, it was their faith that commended them. It was their faith that made them a part of, as Elaine pointed out, what's referred to as the Hall of Faith here in Hebrews chapter 11. So the first one we're going to talk about is Abel. We start near the very beginning with the first victim of a horrendous crime, the man named Abel. We are introduced to him in Genesis chapter 4. As you recall, Adam and Eve had initially two sons, Abel and Cain. Cain was the eldest of the two. Abel was the younger of the two. And so we're introduced to this story in verse 2 of Genesis chapter 4. It's a very brief story. Cain and Abel's story is brief, but it's very important. And I also think it's significant that it's the actually first one that we are introduced to. You might say, well, chronologically that was the first, and maybe so. But I just think it's interesting that we think about this sort of spiritual museum, the Hall of Faith, as we've been talking about it. When you walk in the door, the first monument you see is Abel. Even though his story is somewhat brief, in many ways it's maybe the most important, because it's the first, in human terms, example of faith that we see, faith in action. So how we're introduced to Abel and Cain is through their respective professions. We're told what they do in verse 2 of chapter 4. It says, "Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil." Now, there's no real indication in this passage or anywhere else in Scripture that there's anything wrong with what Cain chose to do, with him being a farmer, as opposed to Abel being a shepherd. And I only mention that, you may not have seen this, but in my time, I've actually heard Bible teachers try to read something into this, that somehow because Abel was a shepherd and Cain worked the grounds, that somehow what he did was more of a works-based thing, and Abel, keeping flocks was somehow more spiritually important. I don't know if you ever heard that before, I have. I find that an absurd spiritual notion. So I only mention it briefly in case you've ever read or heard that. I have. I don't think there's any scriptural evidence that there's anything wrong with what Cain chose to do as an occupation. That's not the point here. And in fact, when we get into God's later explanation in verse 6 about what the problem was that distinguishes the two, it isn't his vocation at all. And in fact, historically speaking, farmers and shepherds were a very honorable, important part of the various professions that God's people had all through history. And in fact, one of the offerings that later would become part of the Mosaic Law was a grain offering, an offering from the fruits of the soil. So I don't think God would, if there was anything at issue about that, I don't think God would include that offering as part of his law. So if you'd ever heard that at all, I would say that there's no truth to that at all. I think that's absurd. There's nothing wrong with what he did. It was not the vocation. The problem had to do with what happened specifically with these offerings. In verse 3 is when we see the problem come about. In the course of time, Cain brought forth some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. In verse 4, but Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. So the text here doesn't give us a lot of detail about exactly what the offering was that Cain offered, or how it was different from what Abel would offer. We really kind of have to read between the lines a little bit and speculate based on God's response that there was an issue with what he offered. So some of the speculations that we can come up with, perhaps that what he offered was too little, holding back most of the crop, maybe only offering just a pittance. Perhaps it was maybe the nature of what was offered. Maybe it was not the finest of the fruit. Maybe it was, the leftovers, the parts that Cain, really didn't want himself. I get this picture of, the potatoes with just the eyes on it, instead of the really nice potato that would look really nice next to a steak on your plate, Maybe it was simply his attitude, the way he gave it. Maybe the fact that he gave it grudgingly. Maybe he didn't really want to do it. He was just doing it because he saw Abel doing it. Out of some sense of obligation maybe, and not really out of love. I think the only real clue we can get in the passage itself is what I have underlined there. He brought forth some of the fruits. And that word some implies that he was selective. He was selective in what he gave to God. Now exactly the nature of that selection is maybe not as important as the fact that he was selective. Clearly that means that he was giving God what he himself didn't want to keep for himself. And again, I think it also gets back to simply the attitude, the way he offered it in perhaps this grudging way, out of obligation and not out of love. So let's talk for a second about what Abel offered, because there's a great contrast there. Abel offered what he called fat portions from some of the firstborn of the flock. So that word "but" there, of course, tells us that there's a contrast in the nature or the kind of offering between the two brothers. I know it's kind of difficult when you think about comparing apples and oranges. This is even more so. This is comparing animals to plants. What's that? Is that like not just two different species, but like two different? Is phyla? Is that the right taxonomic word, or does it go higher than phyla? I don't know. I'm not an expert on that terminology, but comparing animals to grain or to fruit or vegetables, it's kind of a hard comparison. But there was definitely a contrast between these two types of offerings. But there's some things we can definitely say from the text here about Abel's offerings. So Abel's offering was in some sense a complete offering because he had to take the life and shed the blood of that animal in order to make that offering of the fat portions. There was nothing renewable about that particular offering. And think again about what Cain did, offering some of the fruits. I mean, you can kind of imagine he could offer like some ears of corn, but keep the corn plant itself, so that he could keep the some renewable sense of it, like he was giving some of it, but keeping back some of it, so he didn't have to give it all. Well, this animal, in order to get this portion, he had to take its life. It would be different if it said, okay, let's just say, for example, he doesn't tell us what kind of animal, but just say it was a sheep. He could shear the wool off of it and offer the wool to God to keep the sheep, But it doesn't say that. No, what he offered him meant he had to sacrifice the sheep. So there was nothing renewable about it. Once given, he couldn't take it back. He couldn't be used for anything else. The animal couldn't reproduce. It wouldn't be eaten. Its wool or skin wouldn't be used for anything else. In fact, likely it was some kind of a burnt offering, leaving nothing for Abel and giving the whole thing to God. But even another aspect of this, the word there that's translated fat portions, kaleb, the Hebrew word there, it actually means the richest or choicest part. And we think of fat part, I mean, to me that's like, ooh, that's what I wouldn't want anyway, just fat. But the word actually means the choicest part. I think about this, I remember when I was, you don't see this much now, but I know when I was a kid, when Mom would, or go to Grandma's or whatever, she'd fry chicken, and it would be, back then you didn't buy, just things of chicken breast. Usually it was usually a whole chicken. And back then there was always this part called the wishbone. I think they cut chickens now differently. You don't really see that now. But back then that was my favorite part, and it was only one of them, so you usually had to fight over it if there was more than one. It was the choicest part. It was the one part you wanted the most. I also think about growing up, my dad used to always grill out T-bone steaks. And there was one part on the short end of the T that was the fillet, and that was the best part, the most tender part. It's basically the part we get filet mignon from, is the choicest part. So when you see this, the fat portion, it's actually the richest or choicest part that he would offer to God. So it's specifically saying that Abel is giving the best part of this animal to God rather than keeping it for himself. And that would have been like an easy thing for him to go the other way. I mean, a whole animal, he could give the whole animal to God and keep the choicest, just a little piece. I'll just keep the wishbone, God. I'll give you the rest of the chicken. But the wishbone's the best part. That's definitely the part that he offered to God. But not only that, he said it was the firstborn. And of course, as we know, culturally, the firstborn was always considered, of a flock or anything, was always considered the most prized, the most important, the most valued. So he gave to God the choicest part, the filet mignon part, of the most prized animal in his flock, the firstborn. So this, and he gave it in a whole offering, leaving nothing for himself. So this was an offering which cost Abel something. It cost him dearly. And getting back to just the attitude behind it, I think this may have been, and this is Chuck's speculation here, I think this may have been Abel's way of following God's own example. Because if you think about it, at this point in history, what example did Abel have to follow? Well, he wasn't an eyewitness to it, of course, because it was before he was born, but no doubt his father Abraham told him the story of what happens in chapter 3, where God gave Adam and Eve skins to cover their nakedness after their fall, and they realized they were naked, and in order to make those skins, he had to sacrifice an innocent animal in order to make those skins. And so perhaps in some way that influenced Abel, and he recognized that an offering required, the death of an innocent animal. That was the form of sacrifice that God preferred. He was emulating God's own act, demonstrating he was a God follower. I've always liked that phrase. I stole it from Stephen Curtis Chapman from one of his songs, but which he himself got it from one of the primitive tribes in South America that the missionaries discovered, and that was their word for someone who was a believer, was a God follower. I mean, that's what they called them. So I was inspired by that, and I stole that phrase, but it kind of encapsulates part of what faith is that you follow the example of God. We kind of use it when we say someone's Christ-like, or what would Jesus do? We follow the example. Well, in many ways, Abel was following the one example that he had known of, and that was what God himself did. So, again, I think what we can conclude that it was definitely not the sacrifice itself, but what the sacrifice or the offering meant in the heart of the two people. That was a distinction. By emulating God's act, he was demonstrating he was a God follower. Now, we also, of course, know something of the nature of those offerings by looking at God's response as we go along. The Lord looked with favor, it says, on Abel and his offering. That word translated looked with favor, which was translated in the King James Version as respect. It means literally to gaze at something or to look at something, to inspect it, or to consider something. So the way it's used, it implies that God essentially took notice of what Abel did, took notice of Abel and his offering, as opposed to ignoring it or turning away from it. So that was his way of showing respect or favor. He looked at it, he gazed at it, he observed it. That was showing he didn't turn away from it and reject it. It was a sign that he accepted and appreciated the sacrifice that Abel had made, and more likely, the attitude of genuine love behind it. But on Cain and his offering, it says he did not look with favor. It's the same word with just the negation in front of it, with a not in front of it. So what it basically means is God turned his back. He didn't look, he turned away. And that was his sign, his way, that he had no regard for what Cain offered. He rejected the offering. But he wasn't rejecting at this point Cain himself, just the offering. Excuse me. So we see the response now, I think, is what really illuminates or reveals the heart behind it. It wasn't so much the sacrifice. What we see happen really shows that within Cain was some real darkness. It's actually kind of sad and a little frightening when you think about it. Because what we see revealed here is a real heart of darkness in Cain. It says, first of all, Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. The word translated angry there means to blaze up, to be incensed with wrath and with fury. So it's not just saying Cain was disappointed, it means he was inflamed with wrath. It gives you that sort of that whole picture of just somebody boiling over or getting ready to explode. You know how we kind of use the metaphor now, like when somebody's so mad their head's about to explode, That's kind of the way Cain's fury is described here. He was incensed. He was infuriated. And it says his face was downcast. Literally, it means his face fell. So in addition to his anger, he was pouting like a child. And I have in my mind this picture of like a toddler who throws a temper tantrum and kicks and screams and hollers and cries, but at the same time he's pouting, pouting like a baby. Essentially, he did not get his way, is what it boils down to. And I think that really reveals something about his heart, because what he was trying to do by his offering with God was to get God's favor. And when God did not favor his gift, he had a temper tantrum. He didn't get what he wanted out of God. So that proves that what his offering was given to try to get something out of God. He was trying to essentially get God's favor through his offering. Rather than being his offering was just, I love you, God, here's a gift. It was, I want something out of God. And he didn't get his way. God didn't respond like he thought he would. And so he was infuriated by it and pouted and acted like a child. So, like any parent, God came to Cain and tried to reach out to him and tried to help him. And that's why I'm saying at this point Cain's situation wasn't hopeless. He wasn't rejecting Cain. He just said no to this gift because it was not given for the right reason in the right way. But he was reaching out to him. He was going to help him. He was going to give him advice on how he could, how he could grow and mature. And so the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? So his rejection of his offering didn't come without hope. He was providing a way for Cain to gain the acceptance that he sought. Basically through following the example of his brother Abel. Of course, we all know how that goes, how human nature is. You should be more like your brother Abel. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the advice technically, because that's how oftentimes we give advice, is follow the example of someone who is successful in whatever it is you're struggling with. That's how you learn, as you follow somebody's example. I mean, that's the whole Hebrews chapter 11. I mean, that's the author of Hebrews telling us to follow the example of these men and women of faith. But if you don't have the right attitude in your heart to start with, being told to be more like your brother Abel just makes things worse.
I think it's because it's a sibling thing.
Probably.
It's not just because follow the example, but follow the example of your sibling.
Your younger sibling at that.
Oh, yeah. Good point.
So, clearly if he followed that example, which again the example was the attitude of the heart though, right? Then everything would be well. Well, that didn't help. Now, this is what I referred to. It wasn't just a matter of immaturity. This really revealed a heart of darkness that was living in Cain. Because rather than follow God's counsel of following the example of Abel and making the right kind of offering in the right way, the path that Cain chose was deception, murder, and lies. And if there was ever an example in history of what we would call first-degree, premeditated murder, as the old British people used to say, with malice aforethought, this was it. Because it says, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. However, what's significant here, it wasn't like, they got in an argument and a fight and it was just accidental, Abel fell and hit his head on a rock, that would be what you might call manslaughter. Or it was just, maybe he did kill him, but it was just in the heat of the moment, and maybe even Abel taunted him or something like that, and so it was still murder, but maybe it was kind of just heat of the moment kind of thing. No, that's not the case here. It says, Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out into the field. That tells me a number of things. That tells me, first of all, this was a plot. This was something he thought about ahead of time. That he actually went to Abel and thought about this, and he talked Abel into going out into the fields. Why would he go out into the fields? Why would he take him out there? so that there will be no witnesses.
No witness.
That's planning ahead of time, where you lure your victim to where there will be no witnesses, where Adam and Eve, mom and dad, won't be there to see them. I don't know why he thinks God's not going to see it, but he goes out to where there will be no witnesses. And of course, inherent in that is a lie to Abel, because Abel's like, well, why? Oh, I just want to show you something. I don't know. It doesn't say what he told him, but he obviously told him to come out there for some nefarious reason. That was a lie. It was a plot, a plan to get him out there will be no witnesses. And then also, after the deed happens, so he could hide the body, cover the evidence. So this is obviously premeditated murder. And here's the other thing that makes it even the more hideous. It wasn't anything that Abel did to Cain. I mean, there's nothing that justifies murder anyway, but at least you could maybe say you understand where Cain was coming from if Abel had attacked him and he was defending himself. Or if Abel was going, nah, God loves me more than you, taunting him. It still wouldn't justify murder, but at least it would explain why Cain was angry at Abel. None of that is indicated here. Abel didn't do anything wrong. Abel was a completely innocent victim. His only thing was that he was the subject of jealousy and bitterness on the part of Cain. Cain was jealous of Abel's relationship with God. He was angry that God accepted Abel's offering instead of his. And so what this really was, and this is why to me it really reveals that dark heart, he was really angry at God. It was really an act of hatred toward God, because it was God that he was angry at. But he couldn't kill God, so he blamed it on Abel, and he killed Abel instead. Abel was just the object, you might say, of God's favor, so he became the innocent victim because of it. It was really an act of hatred toward God himself. So, because he couldn't kill God, he instead killed Abel. So, of course, he's confronted by God with this. I don't know why he thought he could get away with it. But the next thing we know, God is coming up to him and saying, "Where's your brother?" Well, of course, God knows where his brother is. God's whole purpose in this is to try to get Cain to come clean, to confess, to repent, to show some remorse, to show some sorrow, to at least admit what he did. And because at least in doing so, then maybe God could deal with the sin in that way, with a repentant heart. I mean, we've known from later human history that even the worst murderers can be redeemed. The Apostle Paul being a perfect example, not to mention David. Just committing murder doesn't make you automatically separated from God forever. Even at this point, Cain had the opportunity to repent. And this is why God came seeking him. We've talked about this before. We never come to God as sinners. God always comes looking for us. It's the same thing that happened with Adam and Eve, right?
I was just about to say that whenever you took, I didn't want to interrupt you, but
well, go ahead, but you're right.
That's what I was just thinking, like whenever they sinned in the garden, God knew that they had sinned, but he was like, where are you?
Because they were hiding.
We're hiding. Well, why? Because we're naked. Well, who told you were naked? Like that. I was thinking.
It's exactly the same pattern, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
And God came looking for Cain. Because he already knew the answer, but he wanted to give Cain the opportunity to repent and to show sorrow and all of that. And again, we see revealed in Cain's heart by his response, I don't know where he is. Then he's snarky. The most.
Then he's snarky. Am I my brother's keeper?
Yes, probably the most sarcastic and most famous response in all of human history that we all know. Am I my brother's keeper? And
it's the same thing. Whenever we get caught doing something wrong, we're the same way. We're like, our first instinct is to get mad about it. Well, I don't know. Why don't you?
Am I his babysitter?
Right. You know, like, but we all do that, you know, or I do. I know I do. Like, whenever I get caught doing something wrong and I'm like, I want to get mad about it because I'm like, yeah.
So he just snapped right back at God, you know, really sarcastic, you know. Can you just imagine what we do as parents if one of our kids had said that? Oh no,
Yeah.
you did not say that.
I would have got slapped across the face.
Cain would have been sailing across the ocean at that point, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So we see that immature, sarcastic comment, of course, aimed at God's question. And again, this reveals so much about the heart in Cain. And this tells us everything we need to know about why the offering was not accepted. It wasn't what he offered. It was clearly the spirit that was within him that was not right with God. And offering the wrong offering was just a manifestation. You see, it wasn't the deed, it was what was living in his heart. It was clearly a desire to buy God's favor. It was clearly jealousy that someone else had a more mature relationship with God. It was clearly anger and fury at being caught and being called out on it and being thinking that he had to answer for somebody else. All of these things reveal a wicked heart. And the real thing that is so disturbing when we see someone's heart who has all of this jealousy and bitterness and lies and deception and premeditated murder with malice, you know, against an innocent person who did you no wrong, all because your hatred for God. We're talking about a man that's only one generation from original creation by God himself. And yet, in one generation, we already see how pervasive the power of sin is in this person's life. I mean, that's really remarkable when you think about how we're only one generation away, you know, from creation, and yet sin has already had this kind of a corrupting effect on Cain. It's really remarkable. And so God reveals, of course, that he already knows what we know, that he already knew the answer. The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." So God reveals he does know indeed where Abel is, that Abel is dead and buried, what really happened, and that his innocent blood is crying out to him. Now this has nothing to do with this is a tangent, but it's like whenever I read this particular line, I can't help but think of this. That this is a more universal truth, that the shed blood of the innocent cries out to God. And I think that's true anytime that an innocent person is hurt or killed. But I can't help but think about this, that this also applies to every time that an innocent unborn child dies under the knife of an abortionist, that innocent blood cries out to God, and that will be judged. Because the blood of the innocent cries out to God. Again, that's a tangent to this lesson, and that's a whole other subject, but I can't help but think that when I read this. So, in the last few verses of this passage, God passes sentence upon Cain, but I think it's interesting what he does and what he doesn't do. As I said before, if there was ever a case of premeditated first-degree murder with malice aforethought that deserved capital punishment, it would be this one. But yet, the very first convicted murderer doesn't get the death sentence. He actually is sentenced to live with that guilt and with the consequences of that action. I just find that fascinating that that's what happens here. He banishes him from the very land he worked on. He banishes him essentially from his home. But it says he becomes a wanderer. I don't know, that may, Adam may have kicked him out of the house for all we know, but he becomes banished from the land. And it's interesting, this whole thing started with Cain offering from being a farmer and offering some of the fruits, but keeping back something. Well, part of his punishment is that the ground he works becomes cursed. Apparently, his farm was the most important thing in his life, more important than his relationship with God. So part of his punishment is that essentially the ground is taken away from him, because it will now, instead of blessing him, it will be cursed, and he will have to fight against it all through his life. It would never yield the fruit to Cain anymore, and he becomes a restless wanderer. And then what we see in Cain, though, do we see in Cain any sense of remorse or sorrow or repentance? No, he's very upset, but his upset is all about fear. He says, verse 13, my punishment is more than I can bear. You're driving me from the land. I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. At this point in history, of course, there's no legal machinery yet. There's no judicial system or anything. So I guess if there was any justice, it's a vigilante justice. And I guess his fear is that being marked as a murderer will mean he's gonna get himself murdered somewhere along the way. So his only real regret is that he got caught and he's being punished, and he's going to live with fear. God says, no, you're not going to get off that easy. I guess, giving up his life like that would be too easy. So he put some kind of mark on Cain. We don't know what that is, but in some way he's marked in such a way that no one else is allowed to take his life, or else they will be punished for taking Cain's life. And so he has to live the rest of his life with that guilt and with that shame of knowing that not only was he the first murderer, but he murdered an innocent person for no reason out of anger and hatred toward God. Such a sad commentary on a person's life. And again, what is revealed through the responses in Cain's reaction is that dark heart that lived in Cain. And that was really the reason that God turned from his sacrifice or his offering, is not because of specifically what it was, but because of what it meant. It's a little sidebar here about offerings. It's not in my notes because it was more like something that came to me as I'm talking. A lot of times when we think about our own offerings to God, I think we need to really be mindful of why we're doing it. Part of it is that whole sense of when we give, are we giving because of the legalistic requirements, the Bible saying we're supposed to tithe and all of that, as opposed to it being an offering, a gift out of love. And sometimes, though, I think there's a fine line in there sometimes that our desire to give is genuine, but it still comes from that idea that we think somehow in our giving we're doing God a favor. I don't often quote pastors that I've been under before because so often they're not really worthy of quotation, but there's one particular thing that a previous pastor of mine said that has always stuck with me. There was, when I was first nominated by the congregation to be a deacon, and the pastor and the then chairman of the deacons came over to kind of talk with me, during the counseling part of that before the actual ordination. I was feeling really guilty because I remember one of the things that was one of the deacon requirements to be considered a deacon is many things, but so much of it was that, you're faithful in church and you're active in church and you're doing all of these things. And one of the things that it mentioned was, evidence that you faithfully been giving your tithes and offerings to the church. And when I was nominated was a difficult time for Deborah and I financially, and we were giving sporadically because we just felt like we couldn't afford to give very much. When we did, it was not that much, and it wasn't consistent. And I was feeling kind of intimidated by that, getting nominated to be a deacon. And I remember telling the pastor, that I felt bad about that. I wasn't sure I was worthy to be a deacon because we weren't able to give what I really thought, that we should be giving. And one of the things that I remember saying is, because I really know that, how much the church really needs their tithes and offerings, because they're always standing up there saying how much we need, you to give because of all our ministries and all this kind of stuff. And there's not many things that he said that I remember, but this one thing that he said to me has always stuck with me. He says, God doesn't need your money. God doesn't need our money. So when it comes to, and that is so true, and when it comes to what we offer, whether it's money or anything, whether it's money, whether it's our time, whether it's some other thing, God doesn't need it. God doesn't need anything from us. And I think sometimes, even if it's genuine, our motivation is, okay, I know that I'm going to give this because I know that what I give is going to do good for the church or do good for God. That's the wrong attitude. God doesn't need it. God can do and accomplish whatever he needs to accomplish without us. And he's proven in history he can and will. His will be done. And if we give because we think we're helping out God, even if it's genuine, that's the wrong attitude. God didn't need Cain's grain. He didn't need his crops. He didn't need anything. What he wanted was Cain's love. He didn't need the animal that Abel offered. He didn't need that either. He just wanted Abel's love. And that's what Abel gave, was love. God doesn't need our money, and God doesn't need our offerings. What he wants is our love and our devotion. And that's really the difference between Cain and Abel's offering.
And that's true of our children too.
Yes.
They want our love and our time. They don't want us buying them a bunch of gifts. With us giving them money or giving them gifts is, maybe something they don't need. They'd rather have that time with us.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So what does the author of Hebrews have to say about this? He only gives Abel one verse, but that's really all you need. By faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. So what does he mean by better? The word there mean, depending on how it's used, it could mean more in quantity. But it also can mean better in quality, or superior in quality, or superior in terms of it being the major portion, or by reason of its inward worth. And I think that's really where the distinction is. He concludes that Abel's sacrifice was a superior offering because it was given as an act of faith. Abel believed God. So how was his offering an act of faith? Well, again, we have to speculate because he doesn't tell us in so many words. Maybe he believed that even if he gave a costly offering to God that really cost him something, that God would continue to take care of him and bless him as he always had. Yes, I'm giving you more than I can really afford, but I don't care because I love you and I know that you've promised that you will take care of me. So he believed that God would take care of him. Also, he perhaps believed that God would accept the offering because it was the kind of offering that God himself had modeled, as we said before. If he was modeling God's own behavior, he was saying, well, if I follow God in what I do, then God will accept it. But I think it's even more basic than that, though those may be true as well. It was clearly he was offering out of love and devotion rather than some obligation or favor gathering. it says that he was commended as a righteous man. Now, that word commended is the same one that he used back in verse 2 when he talked about how the ancients were commended by their faith. It's the word martyrio. It's often said that Abel was the first martyr because he was the first one to die on account of his faith. And that's true. And so he really was the first martyr, so I think it's interesting that he used that word. But again, just like we talked about last week, that particular word, it's in the text, it's in the passive voice, and all that means is, the word martyr means to give testimony, to be a witness. And when it's in the passive voice, that means that someone's giving testimony about you. Somebody's testifying about you. So the idea is this good testimony or this favorable witness was given on Abel's behalf. So as such, he was declared to be righteous. It's kind of the same thing that Paul said, that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteous. Abraham was righteous not because he was obeying the law, but because he trusted God. The same thing is being said here. It was, is that Abel believed God, Abel trusted God, so now that commends him as being righteous. It testifies to his righteousness. He was a righteous, a just man, not because of what he did, but because what he did revealed he trusted God. And it was the trust, the faith, those two words mean the same thing in the Greek, that commends him to God. And it says, God spoke well of his offerings. And that's, again, that same word. And what's specific here, I think it's interesting that the author of Hebrews uses this word doron, which means a gift or a present. It's not the word that's normally translated sacrifice, which is a word that implies something that's burned up in an offering. This is the same word that you might use for a birthday present or a Christmas present. It's just something you give to somebody because you love them. You don't expect anything in return. They didn't earn it. I love you, so I'm giving you a present. That's the word that he uses here to describe what Abel did. It was just an expression of his love. It was an outgrowth of his love and devotion to God. And that was why his offering was superior. It wasn't what it was what it meant. Okay? And as a result, he says, and by faith he still speaks even though he's dead. This is just a fascinating phrase. In the way it's constructed, in the Greek, the structure of it is actually dead man speaking. It's this, we have this TV show, The Walking Dead,
Yeah.
This literally means the speaking dead, is what this literally says. Of course, not in this sense, not in the sense of a zombie, but in the sense of his work, his deed, his act of faith, instead of being forgotten in history, it is being remembered in history. It is being lauded in history. As I said when I opened this whole chapter is this great museum of faith, and this is exhibit number 1 when you walk in the door. Abel, for all eternity, is remembered for his faith. We only know very little about Abel. Just those few verses in Genesis chapter 4 is all we know about Abel. But that's all we need to know about him. He was a man of faith who loved God more than he loved himself, who loved God more than the things that he had. And what he did in his offering was an outgrowth of that love and devotion. And it was so strong that it resulted in his death. But even his death testifies to his faith. By his faith, he still speaks, even though he died. Just like his blood cried out to God from the ground, so his death cries out to us through history. Through what his faith cost him. His faith cost him not just the sacrifice, not just that animal. It cost him his life. And that still cries out to us. His act of faith gained him eternal commendation by God, as well as costing him his life. By faith, Abel